It is 3 p.m. in New York, 7 in London, and 4 on a Monday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Gun-young. You're watching ARIRANG, Korea's only global network. We begin with marathon negotiations between the Korean Medical Association and the government. Talks over the weekend seem to have gone some way toward resolving their dispute over a government plan to adopt a telemedicine system and permit hospitals to launch for-profit subsidiaries. ARIRANG News Kwon So-ah has our top story.
A second doctor's strike following last week's one-day walkout may have been averted with a tentative agreement reached by the Korean Medical Association and the government. The KMA and the Ministry of Health and Welfare have been in unofficial negotiations since last Friday on the government's plans to reform the medical sector. They reached tentative agreement on a number of issues after marathon talks on Sunday that lasted until midnight and made separate announcements about the talks on Monday. The agreement covers 4 points. The introduction of a telemedicine system that would enable doctors to diagnose and treat patients using remote monitoring and interactive services. The government's plan to let hospitals set up for-profit subsidiaries, reform of the nation's health insurance system, and shorter work hours for medical residents and interns. The KMA and the government agreed to conduct a 6-month trial run of the telemedicine system in order to test its safety and effectiveness. The system was a major issue that sparked the Medical Association's day-long strike last week. They also agreed to gradually shorten the working hours of medical residents and interns who work around 100 hours a week, which is 20 hours more than in the U.S. In addition, the KMA and the government are talking about setting up a committee to tackle other issues such as health insurance reform. Members of the Medical Association will now vote on whether to go ahead with a second 6-day strike slated to start on March 24th, but with the recent agreement, there is a high chance the strike will be cancelled. The association plans to make a decision on the matter in the next 2 or 3 days. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
Now, North Korea fired off dozens of short-range missiles or rockets into the East Sea on Sunday. Seoul and Washington view this as another provocation and have urged Pyongyang to halt any further actions that would bring about military tensions. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Kim Hyun-bin reports.
South Korea's Defense Ministry officials say they think North Korea's missile launches on Sunday were carried out in response to annual military drills between Seoul and Washington that are still going on.
North Korea fired off 25 missiles at 3 different times on Sunday. We view this as an armed protest against our joint military exercises with the U.S. North Korea needs to stop its provocations.
The U.S. State Department said Sunday that it is well aware of the missile launches and urged North Korea to stop its provocations, which is said are escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Pyongyang did not give any prior notification about the launch. The rockets, which were shot into the East Sea, are believed to have a range of 70 kilometers. They were launched between 6:20 p.m. and 9:32 p.m. Korea time from a location near Wonsan along the east coast. Experts say it's not unusual for North Korea to test fired missiles, but it is unprecedented for the regime to fire off so many in one day. Officials in Seoul believe the rockets were Soviet-made surface-to-surface frogs, which lack precision but are very powerful.
The precision is low, but the missiles can carry up to 550 kilograms of explosives. It can also deliver chemical weapons capable of destroying a military core.
North Korea has test-fired 6 Scud missiles along with 11 rockets from multiple rocket launchers in the midst of the annual military exercises, which started late last month and will run through mid-April. Seoul and Washington say the drills are purely defensive, but Pyongyang routinely condemns them as a rehearsal for invasion. Those latest rocket launches came just 2 days after Pyongyang threatened to demonstrate its nuclear deterrence. The comments seem to be a firm indication North Korea may be preparing for a 4th nuclear test. Kim Hyun-bin, ARIRANG News.
The parents of Megumi Yokota, who was abducted by North Korea some 40 years ago, met their granddaughters for the first time last week. The Japanese Foreign Ministry says Mr. and Mrs. Yokota spent time with their granddaughter, 26-year-old Kim Hae-kyung, in Mongolia from last Monday through Friday. The Yokota's daughter Megumi was abducted at the age of 13 to train North Korean spies in Japanese language and customs. Pyongyang claims she killed herself in 1994, but has not provided confirmation on that. Now, last week's meeting was arranged by the Japanese and North Korean governments during an informal conference held on the sidelines of the two countries' Red Cross talks. The North has officially admitted to abducting 13 Japanese citizens from 1977 to 1983, but hundreds more are believed to have been kidnapped. Now, following President Park Geun-hye's positive response to comments made by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that Tokyo would uphold its landmark apology for wartime sexual enslavement, speculation has been brewing over a possible meeting between the two nations' leaders. But as our Choi Yoo-sun tells us, Seoul wants sincere actions, not just words, to improve ties.
With speculation rife over President Park Geun-hye meeting her Japanese counterpart at next week's nuclear security summit in the Netherlands, Seoul says there's no reason to oppose a sincere and constructive dialogue with Tokyo. Korean presidential spokesperson Min Kyung-wook told reporters Monday what's important is whether any talks can bring out a productive outcome, not having talks for talk's sake. The spokesperson said to create an atmosphere for productive discussions, Japan will have to promptly take concrete steps to resolve its colonial era and other historical issues with neighboring nations. On Saturday, President Park welcomed Prime Minister Abe's affirmation the day before that he had no plan to revise a 1993 apology for wartime sexual enslavement by the Japanese military. This after Abe's chief spokesperson last month said a special team will review victims' testimonies gathered for the apology known as the Kono Statement. Although it was the first time the Korean leader positively assessed Abe's comment on historic issues, the consensus at the presidential office seems to be that Tokyo would first need to prove its sincerity. The Abe cabinet still intends to review how the Kono apology was made and denies there's evidence women were forced to serve as military prostitutes. There, however, is a greater possibility for a three-way dialogue with Washington in The Hague. Ahead of U.S. President Barack Obama's visits to Seoul and Tokyo next month, Washington has reportedly been pressuring both Seoul and Tokyo to improve their strained ties. The United States wants strong trilateral ties with both its Northeast Asian allies to ensure regional stability and cope with potential security threats from China. Choi Yoo-sun, ARIRANG News.
Now on to Ukraine and Crimea. Voting is closed in Crimea in the disputed referendum and on the territory splitting away from Ukraine. Now, with roughly 3/4 of the vote counted, officials say more than 95% of voters elected to join the Russian Federation. However, the West is backing Ukrainian claims that the referendum was illegal. Our Connie Lee reports.
The votes are in, and the polls are now closed. Voters in Crimea spoke with almost one voice on Sunday, with the overwhelming majority voting to leave Ukraine and join Russia. Around 3/4 of the ballots have been counted, and officials say that some 95.5% approve of splitting away from Ukraine. As the votes were counted, supporters celebrated with Russian flags and fireworks.
Fantastic. Of course, I support it. It's the correct decision. And here we also want to hold a referendum and become a part of Russia because people already are fed up.
Opponents of the union and those loyal to Ukraine boycotted the referendum and denounced the vote as a power play by Russia.
This Crimean referendum cannot be true. It should be a referendum for all Ukrainians. It's not a referendum. It's a theatrical performance for Russian people where Russia is legalizing the takeover of these territories.
The referendum offered voters the choice of joining Russia or remaining in Ukraine with greater autonomy. The White House says it will not accept the referendum, which was illegal, and called on Russia to support an international monitoring mission in eastern Ukraine. The European Union also said the vote will not be recognized. EU foreign ministers are expected to meet on Monday to consider imposing sanctions on Russian officials. The referendum came just 2 weeks after Russian troops seized control of the Crimea Peninsula. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
A recent report indicates that while Japan was suffering through a record trade deficit last year, despite the weakening yen, Korea logged its largest annual trade surplus ever. The Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade said Monday that while Japan posted a record trade deficit of over $110 billion last year, Korea logged a record high annual trade surplus of over $44 billion. The institute says the competitiveness of major Korean exports such as semiconductors and auto parts contributed to the record surplus despite the unfavorable exchange rate. A boycott of Japanese products in China launched because of disputes over territorial and historical issues also contributed to the surplus in Korea. Now, Korea and China began the 10th round of negotiations on a free trade agreement in Korea earlier this Monday morning. Seoul's trade ministry says the working-level talks will continue for 5 days from Monday through Friday in Ilsan, northwest of Seoul. The two parties will continue to discuss a wide range of issues, including investment regulations and the goods and services to be included in that agreement. The two sides are also expected to discuss intellectual property rights, quarantine regulations, and technical barriers to trade. Seoul and Beijing agreed to abolish tariffs on 90% of all goods traded between them during previous negotiations. Now, the Korean government is planning to use some of its foreign exchange holdings to help boost foreign investment by Korean companies. Seoul's finance ministry said Monday that the government will use about $10 billion of the country's foreign exchange reserves, totaling more than $350 billion, to provide loans to Korean businesses willing to invest in overseas. Now, the loans will be available at commercial banks starting next month, although lending terms have yet to be fixed. Korea's first ever International Electric Vehicle Expo is currently underway on Korea's southernmost island of Jeju. Many automakers believe electric cars are beginning to have much stronger presence in the market, especially here in Korea. And our Na Hyung-kyung reports.
They are quiet, eco-friendly, and cost-efficient. Industry watchers say electric vehicles, or EVs, are approaching a tipping point. Automakers are producing cars that run entirely on battery power and are now aiming these vehicles squarely at the mass market. The only thing standing before the mass commercialization of EVs is the required infrastructure.
Investment into charging infrastructure needs to be made before the market can expand. The government's support for electric and eco-friendly cars will help boost sales.
In fact, the Korean government has been and is still pushing to ensure there are more electric cars on the nation's roads. Up until last year, you had to live in one of the 10 cities chosen by the government to receive subsidies for EVs, but that regulation is expected to be lifted soon. The government continues to provide subsidies for those purchasing electric cars like the one I'm driving right now, and including various tax benefits and other incentives. This year you could get up to $22,000 in subsidies, and that will make electric vehicles a little bit more price affordable and attractive for customers. The world's major automakers are speaking with one voice in their push to provide zero-emission solutions around the world. The commercial director of Renault's EV program says Korea's customer dynamic is a plus to its market potential.
What is wonderful in Korea it is that the customers don't have a lot of resistances. They are very open to innovation, they are very open to new technologies, and they accept to go very quickly there. So we still think that 10% of the market in 2020 is a realistic target for EV.
Electric cars have been around for decades, but automakers have never been as excited about their mass appeal and viability as they are now. With investment pouring into enhancing battery technology, market watchers say competition in the EV market in Korea is just getting started. Na Hyun-kyung, ARIRANG News, Jeju.
Officials in Korea will launch a fresh investigation into the data leak that hit 3 major credit card companies back in January. The new investigation will focus on an additional breach that affected 80% of the personal information compromised in the first leak. ARIRANG News Kim reports.
Financial regulators will conduct a second special investigation on the 3 major credit card companies swept up in Korea's largest ever data leak. This follows confirmation of an additional breach late last week. The officials will look into how a secondary leak at KB국민 Card, NH-농협 Card, and Lotte Card was possible. Disciplinary measures already slapped on the firms may be toughened depending on the probe's findings. In response, the Financial Supervisory Service has launched a 24-hour monitoring system to block any further leaks. The financial regulator confirmed last Friday that 83 million out of 104 million pieces of data leaked in January has been passed on to brokers. January's massive breach compromised nearly half of the population's personal information. The top executives of the 3 companies have resigned, and the firms in question were hit with 3-month business suspensions in February. There are fears the public's information will be sold on websites like this for as little as 10 cents per sale. Financial authorities say they'll establish new systems so that people reporting illegal data distribution can be rewarded, but the government still has a way to go to convince a skeptical public that it's doing all it can to stop these kinds of leaks. Kim, ARIRANG News.
So as our Kim just reported, financial regulators will conduct a second special investigation into the 3 major credit card companies swept up in Korea's largest ever data leak. Now, there was a confirmation of an additional breach or damage late last week following reassurances from the government back in January that there would not be any additional impact for the public. So how did this happen? Well, for a closer look at the issue, we are joined live in the studio by Dr Kim Jungju, the head of KLMP Consulting, and of course our regular commentator on this program. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
Now, this additional damage that we're talking about, can we call this a second breach?
Yes and no, in the sense that there is a subtle difference here. Basically, what was announced back in January was that this manager at a credit rating agency actually stole this data, and then he sold it to an advertisement agency executive. And they said that was the end of the story. That's what public prosecutors were saying and the financial regulators were saying. But now, last Friday, we learned that there is an additional development in that story, meaning that this advertisement agency manager and the person who stole the data actually resold for the second time to other people and other companies that are engaged in lending business. So this is extension of the boundary itself in terms of how widely the information has been sold or used illegally here. So the boundary itself has increased. As Kim reported, we're talking about 80 million different data sets, data pieces, out of 104 million that they were talking about back in January. So this is about 80% of all that had been affected in January. At that time, when the authorities were saying that they were certain that that was the end of the story, changing hands from the credit rating agency manager to the advertisement agency executive, a lot of people were suspicious because this is not like a national treasure or art piece we're talking about. When you get hold of those, that doesn't mean that they were not copied. Digital products can be copied without a trace here. So public were wondering whether this could be really credible. And as the skepticism went, exactly as we were suspicious, now we are learning that there were other copying and then changing of hands that took place. So indeed, there is a serious damage to the credibility of the government in dealing this issue as a whole. For now, what we learn is that the names and then registration number, address, telephone numbers, and then work information, and as well as credit rating for individuals have been leaked or resold to these individuals. So government is saying because passwords of these financial accounts were not handed over, there's no risk at this point, they're saying, for people copying like a credit card information and then using them in a fake name and stuff. But once again, because the credibility has been damaged, I think the public remains quite skeptical about this.
Right, just the fact that the password had not been leaked, that's no reassurance to us at all, to the public.
Exactly.
So what went wrong exactly? I mean, why so much reassurance back in January just to break the public trust now?
Overall, lack of understanding about how these digital products work in the minds of the top decision makers. We had a big controversy over the Deputy Prime Minister Hyun Ok-seok's comment, right, about consumers having agreed to this, which was not really the case. And now the understanding that this digital information can be copied without a trace, that was a critical point. But the prosecutors and the financial authorities overlooked that, and they said, well, since these people who were arrested confessed, we will have to take those words at face value. That's what prosecutors were saying. And then since prosecutors were saying that there was no more reselling of this information, financial regulators were saying, well, we have to take those words of the prosecutors. So now basically what's happening is finger pointing going on, blaming other people about how that decision of assuring the public came about. But the thing is, in a way, I do understand the public policymakers' sense of urgency at that time. In financial sector, rumors can create a lot of difficulties and chaos in a way. So they were quite desperate to, put off the fire of the possible spread of this kind of rumors and panic and stuff. So that's credible. But the thing is, what they should have said was, at this point, we do not have an evidence that this information was resold. That's what they should have said, rather than saying, we are quite confident that there was no resale involved here. So that's why they kind of undermined the overall trust of the public and made a critical mistake while they were kind of like really under attack of this anxiety attack for fear and rumor and stuff.
Right, because panic is no good news for
in
the market.
Sector,
of
right.
course not. Now, excuse me, it was just a week ago that the government announced this, what they called comprehensive measures for prevention for future leaks. So what now? I mean, does the government have any more options or any more action that they can take in order to, in response to this additional leak?
The answer would be not really, because as we discussed before about last week, the announcement of March 10th itself came out after 3 rounds of delays because of the industry lobbying and all these concerns on the business side and stuff. Government had a great difficulty in coming up with a comprehensive announcement. So we are not expecting any additional announcement of additional safety measures here. Rather, the government is saying now they're focusing on those possible victims of this resale of their personal information. And they're saying these credit card companies are contacting those people whose information have been leaked. But because the amount is so large, I wonder, myself is included here once again, as I was back in January, and I don't know how they can actually reach out to so many people in this case. So once again, continuously there's this question about the credibility about what the authorities are saying.
Now, excuse me, experts talk about the various systemic problems or shortcomings behind these accidents. Now, fundamentally speaking, what are some of the most important ones that we should focus on?
There are several fundamental issues. For the interest of time, let me just touch upon just one thing. That is, so far, what's been happening in Korea is government and the consumers who are taking the responsibility, pretty much. Meaning that, when we set up a financial online transaction of financial services, we had to install all of these programs, right, to protect the data on our side as consumers. And then government laid out all these guidelines, detailed guidelines that financial institutions had to follow. What does that mean? What that means is financial institutions, as long as they follow those guidelines and require customers to install all these protective measures, they are pretty much free from taking the responsibility, basically. They can argue, well, we've done all that has been required, so we are okay. Now, experts are saying that needs to be changed. Government should get rid of those guidelines, give greater freedom, if you will, or right to for these corporations to do whatever they think are necessary, give them freedom, and then ask for their accountability when things go wrong. So that fundamental shift, overall orientation of this kind of online transactions need to be taking place, experts are saying. In that case, just like other advanced economies, businesses will be very much interested in, protecting themselves. So they'll come up with various different kind of measures, not necessarily uniform measures, but different measures to protect themselves. And that's the way to go. In order to make that happen, what now should take place at the lawmaking body, legislation, legislature, National Assembly, is to introduce new laws for class action and the punitive damage, claims that would be made possible by this new law. So those kind of actions are expected. It should take place at the legislature, but we do know at the legislature there are a lot of business lobbyists that are asking for less burden and minimum amount of burden. So that's the dilemma.
And therefore, this cannot happen overnight, so it will take some time.
Right.
All right, Dr. Kim Jungju, thank you so much for today. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Okay.
And that's all from me at this hour. Thank you for watching. I'll see you back here in less than 2 hours' time on Early Edition at 6.